Marcion, founder of the 2nd century Christian group imaginatively called the Marcionites, had some beliefs that would be cause for stoning in the life of Brian. This week, Dr. Bart Ehrman joins me to talk about what those beliefs were, Marcion's own personal gospel, and what other Christians thought about it. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Happy October, friends. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about some special offers this month, including courses on sale for up to 50% off, a newly launched Halloween-themed course, a way to get Mark Goodacre's latest book for free, and a special buy one, get one too offer on our new discussion series, Face to Face on the Bible. Proceeds help keep this podcast going, and we truly appreciate your support. You can find all the details at bartehrman.com/October, and be sure to use the code MJPodcast for a special discount. Welcome back to Misquoting Jesus, where this week we're talking about Marcion, possibly the first Christian heretic. We've also got listeners' questions at the end, where I'll be asking whether the disciples staged Paul's vision of Jesus, and what 3 questions Bart would ask the writer of the Gospel of Mark. So be sure to stick around for those. Bart, before all of that, how are you this week?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. You know, we're sort of in the middle of a semester now, and the students who looked very bright-eyed and eager on the first week or two are now looking a little bit worn out. And so between studying and frat parties, I think it takes its toll after a while. Yeah. So
everyone's counting down to the Thanksgiving break.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. How are things on your end?
Good, very good. We've been making Halloween costumes and we're doing a pirate theme this year. So Oliver and I are building a giant, I think I mentioned this, a giant cardboard treasure chest.
Yeah, she said.
Coming along quite nicely, yeah.
You're trying to convince him not to get it filled up all the way.
Yes. It's nearly 3 feet tall. I can't afford, apart from anything else, to fill a 3-foot tall chest with candy.
How tall is Oliver?
He's not much taller, to be honest. He's about 4 foot.
Okay, good. Sounds about right.
Now, for our icebreaker, you are just about finished with your new book, Love Thy Stranger. It's out of your hands. You've done some of the editing, and it's off to publishers and all that kind of stuff. So along those lines, I was wondering if any of your books were harder to write than others. Did you have one that just was not working?
Oh, I've never had one that wasn't working. I've never had a lot of people get kind of writer's block, or they have idea block and they just can't figure things out. And it's never been like that for me, but there are some that are really hard. And so, because I write a range of books, I write textbooks, those are hard. I write popular book for audiences, those are hard for different reason. I write academic books, but in terms of really real difficulty, it's the academic books that are hard. Among the trade books, they're hard in a different way because you've got to learn how to communicate with people and such. But so I think the one book that was the hardest of mine to write was Forgery and Counter-Forgery, the use of literary deceit in early Christian polemics. It's a big book. It's over 600 pages, and it deals with every forgery in early Christianity that looks like was being designed for argumentative purposes, for polemical purposes. And it meant having to do research into forgery in Greek and Roman circles unrelated to Christianity, going back as far as we have literature. And it was a really, really intense study. I had to take a couple of years of academic leave in order to do the research. And it was intense. It was really, and now it's the kind of thing where I look back, I'll read a few pages and say, oh my God, I knew all that. What? How in the world could I possibly have known that? And, so it's just extensive research, and that kind of thing is so hard. It's hard to research. It's hard to write. It's just hard. And when I got done with that one, I said, man, I'm not doing that again. Although then I did write another academic book. But so, yeah.
Thank you. Now on to the main event. Today we're talking about Marcion, first great Christian heretic. Do we know where he lived and what time period he was active during?
There are different opinions among scholars, but there's a consensus that's been around for a long time, and I think it's probably right. It seems to be right, which is that Marcion was active in the starting in probably the first half of the second century. He we don't know when he was born, but he would have been an adult probably in the 130s. And he comes from an area that is called Pontus. If you think about Turkey today and you think about like central Turkey, the north central part up against the Black Sea, there are a number of cities there. And there's one it's still there today, but in antiquity it was called Sinope. And he apparently was he's connected with the shipping industry, and he may have owned a shipbuilding company, or somehow was involved with shipping, but he made a lot of money, so he was fairly wealthy, living in Sinope. There are other rumors that his father was a bishop of a church there. We don't really know for sure about that. So, but he's active. We know that he's active from sort of around 139 or so up into the mid 140s, and then we kind of lose track of him.
How do we know about Marcion and his group?
Marcion did produce some writings, but unfortunately they don't survive. And so we know about him because of his opponents. There were, these would be Christian proto-orthodox opponents. So Christians who were holding to the views of Christianity that later got declared as orthodox, that became the dominant views. Two authors in particular, Tertullian, who was a North African church father living around 200, and then much later Epiphanius, who's living at the end of the 4th century, who's a Greek writing church father, who's not as reliable in a number of ways. First, because he's living much later, but also because everybody who's talking about heresies in early Christianity has an axe to grind. And Epiphanius is a little more straightforward than most about the axes he's trying to grind. And he often twists things. And so you have to be very careful using Epiphanius. But Tertullian, you have to be careful with him too. But between the two of them and a few other sources, we get a pretty good of information about Marcion.
So what were some of his core beliefs?
So Marcion's interesting in lots of respects. One is that he thought that the Apostle Paul was the apostle who got it right, and that the reason Paul had to be called to be an apostle in the first place is because the disciples of Jesus, who were apostles before the original apostles, got it wrong. Paul was the one who emphasized that there's a distinction between the law of the Jews and the gospel of Christ. And in Paul's writings that we still have, the ones that we still have, like in his letter to the Galatians or the letter to the Romans, he makes a very strong case that keeping the Jewish law is not what puts a person into a right relationship with God. That what puts a person in relationship with God is the death of Jesus, and that a person is saved by the grace of God because of Christ's death, not because of the law. So Paul himself differentiates between the law of the Jews and the gospel of Christ. Marcion takes that differentiation and runs with it to an extreme that I think Paul would not have been happy with. But Marcion claimed that in fact there's an absolute distinction between the law and the gospel, that the law belongs to Jews. And the law tells Jews how they are to live their lives and what they're supposed to do and think and behave, and that Jesus came to save people from the law, and that they are so distinct from each other, that the message of Jesus is so distinct from the message of the Jewish law that in fact Jesus came from a different God from the one who gave the Jewish law. And so Marcion, at the sort of foundation of his understanding of things, is that Paul believed that there were two different gods, and that so the God who gave the law was the God of the Jews. He called Abraham to be his follower, gave Abraham his covenant, gave Moses the law. Jews follow his law, but the problem is that nobody can follow it well. And so because of that, this God who called Abraham, who, by the way, is the one who created the world, that God created the world, that God it's not that he's wicked, but he's very just. And because he's just, when people break his law, he punishes them, and nobody can keep his law. and so he sends everybody to hell. Jesus came from a different God, who is a superior God, who is unknown to the God who created this world. Jesus comes to save people from the wrathful justice of the God of the Jews. And so Jesus represents a different God, and the gospel of Jesus is not just unrelated to the law of the Jews, it's opposed to the law of the Jews.
So if the Marcionites viewed Jesus as coming from a different God entirely, is he viewed as the Son of God, a messenger, some kind of angel figure? What are their thoughts on that?
As with all things with Marcion, it's hard to piece together the details because all we have are what his opponents say about him. And we have to read that with a pound of salt. And so because, they're obviously saying nasty things about him. And so we have to kind of weed through it all. And it's not an easy task. But he definitely does not think that Jesus is the Son of God in the sense that he's the son of the Old Testament God who's predicted by the scriptures. Marcion does think that the Jewish scriptures are predictive. They are predicting a Messiah. But the Messiah that the Jews are expecting is not Jesus. That's going to be some other kind of human Messiah, like a warrior figure of some kind, who will be the Messiah for the Jews. The Christian Messiah is not that. The Christian Messiah is Jesus. And Jesus, his understanding of Christ, his Christology, is a little bit hard to get our minds around. We're not quite sure exactly how it works out, but the thing that looks pretty definite is that he did not think that Christ was really a human being. The logic behind this is that the material world, was created by the God of the Jews. And anything that is part of the material world belongs to the God of the Jews. So Jesus could not be physically born and be a material being, because if he did, he'd belong to the God of the Jews, but he comes from the other God. So Marcion does not think Jesus was born at all. Tertullian has a quotation that indicates that for Marcion, Jesus descended from heaven as a full-grown adult during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. And so there's no birth or childhood or anything like that. He came down in the appearance of a human flesh. He looked like a human being, but he was not a human being. This is a view that we've talked about before on the podcast, called Docetism. The term Docetism is it comes from a Greek term that dokeo, which can mean something like to seem or to appear. And a docetic Christology is one that says that Christ appeared to be human, but he was actually divine, and so he did not participate in the material world. And so they would not have called him the Son of God. They thought he was God in the flesh, but the question is, the relationship of him and the other God.
Do we know what they thought about the crucifixion, either what actually happened or its purpose in terms of atonement versus sacrifice?
Well, this is where it gets even fuzzier, because Christ is not a material being, so he doesn't really have flesh and blood. But Marcion did emphasize that Christ was crucified and that it's faith in his death that somehow brings salvation. So Marcion, some people may be wondering, is Marcion more like a Gnostic? And we've talked about Gnosticism a bit on here, but Gnosticism is many people for years thought of him as a Gnostic, Marcion as a Gnostic, but he's not a Gnostic. Gnostics tended not to be docetic. They tended to think that Jesus was a human and that Christ was a divine being, and they were temporarily united somehow, and that it's the mystical teachings of Jesus that bring salvation, understanding the secret truth that Jesus reveals that brings salvation, and that's got nothing to do with his death. Marcion doesn't think it's the secret truths of Jesus that bring salvation. He thinks that, in fact, and that he doesn't think Jesus is two beings, a divine being and a human being. He thinks there's one being, Christ. He's a divine being that just looks like human, but somehow his death brings about salvation. And so we're not quite sure how he worked it out. What exactly was he thinking? Because Jesus couldn't really be shedding blood because Jesus didn't have blood. So is it, for example, like one option that one might think of is that maybe it's that people are enslaved to the God who created this world, because they belong to him because they're material beings, and that this God will accept a sacrifice for the sins of others, Christ seems to die for the sins of the world, and that God accepts the sacrifice, not knowing that he's been duped. And so that's how it brings salvation. Possibly it's something like that.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a very brief break. When we come back, we will talk about the Gospel of Marcion and how his views were received by the proto-orthodox church. Hello, everyone. When we originally recorded this episode, I managed to give the wrong announcements entirely. This is all my fault. Sorry, Chris. But the event that this announcement is for us tonight, so actually it's quite important that you get the right announcements for this episode. And if you have ever wondered what scholars discuss behind closed doors, then tonight's event is definitely for you. Tonight, we're taking you behind the scenes with our first ever face-to-face on the Bible discussion. This is part of a 3-discussion series on the Gospel of John, and we're starting this evening at 7 p.m. Eastern with AJ Levine and Hugo Mendez discussing history and propaganda in John. This will be followed by 2 more live discussions on Sunday, October 26th, with Paula Fredrickson and Robin Walsh, who will go face-to-face on the historical reliability of John, followed by Mark Goodacre and Bart Ehrman discussing whether John knew the synoptics. It's live, completely unscripted, and completely unrehearsed. Tickets are $39.95 per session, but right now you can grab a special launch deal. You buy 1 session and you get 2 free, and you can sign up at bartehrman.com/face-to-face. The second announcement, which is also time sensitive, is that this Sunday, that's the 26th of October, is your last chance to sign up for Bart's new course about heresies in the early church with the early bird pricing. You can go to bartehrman.com/heresy. That's HERESY for more details. Sorry about the unscheduled change in announcements. Again, entirely my fault. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the interview. And now we can get back to the interview and look at Marcion's gospel, which is, I'd like to write my own gospel. I think that's the gospel according to Megan would be a bestseller.
It absolutely would be a bestseller. No, what are you waiting for?
So you said earlier before our break that Marcion wrote a lot of his own stuff, but we don't really have any of it. What we know about him is preserved in writings by his critics. So what do we know about the Gospel of Marcion?
So the deal with Marcion is that he apparently was developing his views about Christianity in his hometown, Sinope, and the traditional dating is that in the year 139, he decided to move to Rome, and he moved to Rome because that's where the biggest church was, and that's where the action was, the Christian action was, and he made a huge donation of money to the church, apparently to get on their good side. Which succeeded. But then he spent 5 years in Rome and spent the time kind of developing his theological views and producing writings from it. And we know of two writings of his. One is he produced some kind of edition of a New Testament, a canon of the New Testament, which he collected books that he thought were canonical, and he edited them. According to what the church fathers say, Tertullian and Epiphanius, that he edited them radically, producing a new form of the gospel. And he wrote a second book that's called The Antitheses, that we can talk about, which is trying to set up the relationship between the law of the Jews and the gospel of Jesus. So in terms of the gospel, he appears to have had some kind of gospel that was very similar to what our Luke is, our gospel Luke, and he molded it in ways, according to the church fathers, he altered it in ways to make it more palatable, more acceptable for his perspectives.
So what kinds of things do we think the gospel kind of edited out of Luke's work?
So it's a little bit hard to know exactly how this worked because the church fathers are scornful. Tertullian says that he edited Luke with a knife, which means he just cut out the parts he didn't like. And the problem is that if Marcion doesn't believe that Jesus is part of the material world, and he doesn't think that Jesus represents the God of the Jews, the God of the Old Testament, then if Jesus quotes the Old Testament positively, that can't have been what Luke originally wrote. He doesn't, by the way, he doesn't call it Luke. He just calls it the gospel. And so we don't know if he thought it was by this person Luke or not. But the church fathers say he cut out a lot of the stuff that was contrary to his views, and including, they say that he cut out the birth narratives, because Jesus could not be born in this world if he didn't belong to the Creator. So his gospel didn't have Luke chapters 1 and 2. It didn't have passages that seemed to be affirming the beliefs of the proto-orthodox about the Old Testament and the God of the Jews, etc. I'll say, though, that there's a problem. There's a problem that scholars have recognized increasingly over the last 20 or 30 years, which is that we aren't really sure when a church father quotes like what Marcion has in his gospel. We can't really tell if that's something that Marcion himself created, or if the form of Luke that he had available to him was different from the form of Luke we have today. You see, because he doesn't call it Luke, and it doesn't have the first 2 chapters. Well, there are actually reasons for thinking that what we call Luke originally, when it was originally published, did not have the first 2 chapters. I think we might have had an episode on that. If we didn't, we should. But it's like, and so maybe he inherited a form of Luke that's different. So that's one problem, is that we don't really know what he had, so we can't really tell what he took out. The other thing is, even the church fathers admit that there are things in there that are contrary to his views. And so if he took stuff out, it didn't seem like he took them out very consistently. So was he actually editing something in Luke, or did he inherit something that's different that we call now, that developed into what we now call Luke? This is a really thorny problem that doesn't have an easy solution.
Was the gospel popular in antiquity?
Well, it's certainly popular among Marcion's followers. Marcion had developed a very, very large following. Just go back to biography just for a second. I mean, I said he went to Rome 139, left in 144. What apparently, according to the church fathers, what happened is he finally devised his writings. We'll still talk about the antitheses in a second, but he developed these writings and he presented his views according to these Tertullian and Epiphanius to the Roman leadership of the Roman Church, apparently expecting that they would buy into it, and his form of Christianity would then become Christianity. But instead, they found his views offensive, and they kicked him out of the church. So he apparently had called a council of the leaders of the Roman Church. This would have been the first church council that we know of. And he got them together. They probably paid attention to him because he made this huge donation. But then when he presented his views, they thought that they were completely false and not acceptable. They excommunicated him from the church, which is the first time we hear of an excommunication like that. And they gave him his money back. They said, "Get out of here."
Wow.
And so then, yeah, they were serious. And they, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to keep your money, though. They got rid of him completely, cut ties altogether. But then we lose sight of him at that point. But it looks like he went on a mission, doing missionary work in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. And he had a huge following. We hear of church fathers in the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th centuries talking about how large these Marcionite churches are, and how people need to be careful because a traveler might go to church in town and it turns out it's a Marcionite church. They wouldn't even know it at first, and so it's a widespread movement, and all of these churches would have used his form of a gospel, or something closely related to his form of the gospel. So it would have been pretty popular, but we don't have any copies like that.
What did the proto-orthodox Christians find particularly offensive about what he was saying?
Well, this relates closely to his other book, The Antitheses, because I mean, of course they thought, look, there are not 2 gods. In the Old Testament, God says, "I alone am God," and there is no other. There's one God, and the Old Testament was the book that Jesus used. So of course we have the Old Testament. We have one God, and that means that the God who created this world is the God of Jesus. And they just disagreed with his major points up and down the line. But to do that, they had to contend with this book, The Antitheses. I often get asked, is there one book from the ancient world that's been lost, Christian world that's been lost, that you'd like to get? Boy, I'd like to get my hands on the Antitheses because it sounds really interesting. He does so an antithesis is a contrary statement. And what he does is he sets up, apparently, since we don't have it, apparently what he does is he sets up what an Old Testament passage says and contrasts it with what Jesus says to show that they can't be the same. And so, for example, he describes the Battle of Jericho in what's now Joshua chapter 6, where the Israelites are supposed to destroy the city, and God assists them by making the walls come tumbling down, and God tells them to go in and to kill every man, woman, and child in the city. And they do. So that's the Old Testament God. What about the New Testament God? The New Testament God says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And does that sound like the God who told you to kill every child in Joshua? No, it's a different God. Or another example that a lot of my students like is there's this story in 2 Kings of the prophet Elisha. And Elisha is walking by a group of boys in some outdoor setting, and the boys are making fun of him because he's going bald, and so they cry out, "Baldy, baldy!" and Elisha calls down the wrath of God on these kids, and two she bears come out of the woods and maul, 52 of them to death. That's what the God of the Jews is like. And what about Jesus? Jesus says, "Let the little children come unto me." Is this the same God? No, it's not the same God. And so the antithesis was that kind of thing, filled with that kind of thing. And so, the church fathers had to explain, how this could be the same God.
How did they do that?
Well, the way people do today, that, God is a God of justice as well as a God of love. And that it's not just one-sided. God has many, many attributes, that he punishes disobedience. He punishes those who oppose his servants. He opposes anyone who, who holds to false religious beliefs and they're leading others astray. And that, over time, God actually, it's not that God develops, but the plan of salvation develops over time. So that the law of the Jews was given for one period, and then Jesus came to fulfill the law, and now we're under the laws of Jesus, and that it's kind of a continuation. It's not a radical differentiation.
Do we know, I suspect the answer is no, but do we know whether Marcion's excommunication actually had any impact on the popularity of his beliefs?
We don't really have information like that. All we have are these reports, and for Marcion, it may in the end have been a good thing because it led him to engage. It looks like he and his followers engaged in extensive missionary work, so that his church grew and grew, and so it remained a problem for a very long time. Pretty much, it was. I mean, by the time you get to the 4th century, most of Christendom is accepting the basic ideas that are embodied in orthodoxy. There's only one God. He created the world. He called the Jews to be his people. He gave them the law. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Jesus is both human and divine. Jesus' death brings about salvation for sins. These became the standard beliefs. But you still have groups like the Marcionites, and as we'll see in this course that I'm going to be doing on heresies, you have various groups of Gnostics and various groups of Jewish Christians, various kinds of groups saying various things. But by the early 4th century, and probably somewhat before that, there's one group that basically is dominating Christianity, and it becomes the standard. It holds the standard beliefs on these major topics.
What do you think Paul would have made of Marcion's beliefs?
Yeah. So, of course, we don't know. We can't get into Paul's mind. And the problem, we know more about Paul than we know about any other early follower of Jesus. Arguably, we know more about Paul than we know about Jesus, because we actually have things that he wrote. But we only have 7 letters that we're pretty sure he wrote. We have 6 others that claim to be by him in the New Testament. We have a book that's written about him, the book of Acts. But these other letters are problematic. for reasons we could talk about sometime. The book of Acts is historically problematic. It has some historically reliable stuff, but at times it completely contradicts what Paul says about himself. And so it's really kind of, we have later legends of Paul. It's really hard to know really what Paul thought about a lot of things, but things that he almost certainly believed is that the God of the Jews is the God of Jesus, and that Jesus really was a human being, that Jesus really did shed his blood. There's only one God. He's the creator. Christ is in some sense a human. He's in some sense divine. Paul doesn't work out how it works exactly. So the kinds of things that Marcion takes Paul, like when he takes Paul and runs with him, he goes in a different direction from the way Paul would have gone. I'm fully sure. Although it's interesting when you read like scholarship on early Christianity, there's this old line that was I thought was always rather clever, that in the 2nd century, Marcion was the only one who understood Paul, and he misunderstood him. But what it means is that it took Paul seriously, that where Paul doesn't just follow the teachings of Jesus, that you repent and God will forgive you, that Paul understands that Christ's death made a huge break, and that there's a differentiation between the law and the gospel. Marcion understood that, but he misunderstood it.
He understood, and then he took several steps further.
Yeah, right. Too far. Right.
Do you think Marcion's views would be popular among modern Christians?
Oh, so here's the irony. Of course, just about anybody who's a Christian today would say, yes, Marcion was a heretic, and he had these false beliefs, these kind of wild ideas. He had, I guess I didn't mention this, but he had his gospel, and he had 10 of Paul's letters in his canon, so he had an 11-book canon, and he didn't have the Old Testament, he didn't have the rest of the New Testament. He had 11 books. He by the way, he may have been the first Christian. He is the first Christian on record who actually said this is the canon. Like, who set a canon? But today people say, no, 11 books? No, man, we got 27, and we have an Old Testament. And so they reject that. They reject the idea there are literally two gods. They reject the idea, that Jesus was not a human. They reject that. But a lot of people who are committed Christian believers, especially those who are sort of come from a conservative realm, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, they would deny being Marcionites, of course, but they have beliefs that are really kind of similar to Marcion. I mean, most of my students at Chapel Hill, for example, think that of course Jesus is divine and human, but at the end of the day, they really think he's divine. They don't really think that he's human. The idea that that Jesus could make a human mistake, of course not. He's God. That Jesus could be limited in his knowledge, of course not. He's God. That there are things Jesus could not do, of course not. He's God. And when you keep pressing it, he's God. It's never that. It's never, oh yes, but he's human. It's always, no, but he's God. He couldn't do that. He wouldn't. And so the divinity of Jesus is emphasized so much that his humanity pretty much disappears. There really is he kind of seemed like he was a human, but he wasn't really a human. And if my students don't know anything about the history of heresy, they'll say something like that. I think that's very common. The other issue is all the time. I have people who get into conversation with me. They find out I'm a biblical scholar, and they'll make this kind of authoritative pronouncement how there's a difference between the Old Testament God of wrath and the New Testament God of love. And that is exactly Marcion's point, is that you have wrath versus love, and that there are different gods. And today people won't say, well, there are literally two different gods, but I don't know what they're thinking. Or do they think God grew up or something, like he got older and more mature? Or that like he changed his mind?
Teenage years.
He was a teenager back then, man. He's wrathful. He's like, and so so I don't know what they're thinking, but it really means that they understand that the God of the New Testament is different from the God of the Old Testament. And they'll say that he's different, but they won't have an explanation for it. Just, sometimes it's because sometimes it's anti-Jewish. They're not thinking anti-Judaism, but it's just, the Jews have a wrathful God and we Christians have a loving God. And when somebody, gives me that line, I usually just ask them, well, have you read the book of Revelation lately? It's in the New Testament. You talk about wrathful God. I mean, destroying Jericho is one thing. This is destroying the world. And but people I think people have Marcionite like views, even though they would say, yeah, no, I'm not a Marcionite.
Final question for our conversation today. Do you think it's reasonable to call Marcion the first great heretic?
I would say that he's the first great heretic that we know of by name who came to be widely regarded as a heretic. There are others that we know by name, but they're not like famous like he was. I mean, who are possibly somewhat earlier, but people like Basilides and things. They're kind of people who are kind of proto-Gnostics. The other, I think maybe a lot of scholars might say that Simon Magus is the first, but I'm not sure that Simon Magus was a real human being. I don't know. Marcion was definitely a real human being, and he definitely was the one who was condemned. And so, to that extent, he's kind of the beginning of heresies in the sense of being related to known individuals who are condemned by the broader church.
Thank you so much, Bart. We're going to take a very brief break and then we'll be back with the listeners' questions. Jesus and Paul are the two most important figures in the history of Christianity. But did they even agree with one another? Join acclaimed scholar Bart Ehrman in his online course, Paul and Jesus, The Great Divide, where you'll dive deep into the complex relationship between Paul and Jesus, explore their differing views on crucial issues, and uncover the profound impact of their teachings on the early Christian faith. In this 8-lesson course, you'll gain valuable insights into the historical context of Jesus and Paul's beliefs, their views on salvation, and their understanding of the Jewish law. Don't miss out on this unique opportunity to enrich your understanding of these influential figures. Visit bartehrman.com/Paul to learn more or sign up today. And remember to use discount code MJPodcast for a special offer. Once again, that's bartehrman.com/Paul with a discount code MJPodcast. Okay, we have some listeners' questions. I gave a teaser right at the top of the episode, and we're just going to dive right into them. This is purely speculation, and it's speculation that I adore. But has it ever been considered by scholars that the experience Paul had on the road to Damascus could have been staged by the followers of Jesus in order to stop him from persecuting them?
I'm not sure I understand it. So the Christians stage Paul's vision.
Someone dresses up like Jesus and appears to him on the road of Damascus so that Paul will then stop persecuting them. I love the idea.
Oh, I'm sure somebody's thought of it. When you got a field of scholarship that's going on for 2,000 years, a lot of people since the Enlightenment are really skeptical about things. I'm sure somebody's thought of it, but I'm not sure I've heard it before. So, right, they put on a show for Paul. Paul, why are you persecuting me? And yeah, well, it seems unlikely. I'll put it out. It seems kind of unlikely to me for a wide range of reasons. I don't think that the Christians were that advanced yet to come up with that one.
Not a large place for amateur dramatics in
no
first century. Do you think that modern Christianity is a syncretism of Judaism and ancient Greco-Roman religious ideas?
I think every religion is a syncretism. Every religion that develops is like and unlike other religions. And since it's like other religions, almost always it's because it's been influenced by other religions. And so I just think that I think every religion is that way. And yes, certainly Christianity is rooted in Judaism, but the way it develops has been influenced by wider Greek and Roman religions of the environment. So yes, I'd say that. But Judaism itself is a syncretic religion. And I think every religion is syncretic.
There are so many contradictions in the New Testament canon. Why is it that the church, when the canon was being put together, didn't just edit things so that they all agreed? Have one gospel that tells the complete story and letters and other books that all agree with each other?
Well, they did to some extent. I mean, in the 2nd century, we have a church father, Tatian, who took the 4 Gospels and combined them into one big gospel without contradictions. It's called the Diatessaron. Unfortunately, we don't have that book either. Most Christians in the ancient world did not see the contradictions. And you think, well, that's weird, is it? How many people today see these contradictions? The adults, students I talk to, when I point these out to them, they say, oh, why didn't I ever see that before? Well, because you just assumed it wouldn't be there. And so I think that was true in the early church too. Sometimes they did edit out problems. That's what the scribes were sometimes doing. And so in my books on like the orthodox corruption of scripture or misquoting Jesus is about how scribes sometimes did change the text to make them more palatable and more consistent. But by and large, I think a lot of people didn't notice them. If they did notice them, they came up with explanations for them.
Final question for today. I'd like you to imagine a scenario in which you are able to put 3 questions to the anonymous author of Mark. What would those 3 questions be?
Number 1, what were your sources of information about Jesus? Number 2, in what sense do you think Jesus was divine? Number 3, why do you think Jesus kept his messiahship secret?
Excellent answers. And fantastic questions, audience. Thank you all very much. Now, before we finish for the week, Bart, would you mind reminding us what we spoke about today?
Yeah, we were talking about Marcion, a very early Christian heretic. We didn't talk what the term heretic means, but it means somebody who's teaching false doctrines, false ideas. And Marcion became famous because he advocated ideas that were popular in some circles and threatening in others. And so he's one of the first heretics we know about who's attacked by church fathers for his false teachings. But the false teachings he propounded sound reasonable to many people still today.
Audience, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember that you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.bartehrman.com, and that this week is your last chance for early bird pricing on Bart's new course on heresies, the earliest Christian heresies. You can find more information at bartehrman.com/heresy. That's HERESY. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week, but what are we talking about next time?
Oh, we're having a Halloween episode. We're going to talk about the zombies in Matthew. Jesus gets crucified, and these people come back to life and start walking around Jerusalem. What in the world is that all about? It's only in Matthew, and we're going to try and figure it out.
Thank you all, and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.